Is David Lurie a predator? Is he a disgraced man? Or is he just a deeply unreliable narrator? Well, what if he's actually all three? If you've ever picked up J.M. Coetzee's incredible novel Disgrace, you already know it centers around this completely uncomfortable dilemma, and it flat out refuses to hand us any easy answers. Today, we're diving into a fascinating conversation where leading literary scholars dissect this exact question, totally unpacking the disturbing, complex mind of the novel's main character. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a visual deep dive straight into the psychology of David Lurie. We're going to draw directly from top Coetzee scholars to break down the narrative traps, the messy power dynamics, and the genuinely unsettling humanity of a deeply, deeply flawed character. Section 1. Inside David Lurie's Mind, the Trap of Narrative Intimacy. Okay, so right from page 1, we are trapped. We are entirely inside David Lurie's head. Now, the author could have easily written this from multiple perspectives, right? Or used an omniscient narrator to tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, David's doing something terrible here, but he doesn't. And that extreme proximity is incredibly dangerous for us as readers because of a fascinating concept called ethical unreliability. The scholars, especially Dominic Head and Mike Murray, make this brilliant point. David isn't your typical, obvious, unreliable narrator. He doesn't completely make things up or lie about the basic facts of what he's doing. Actually, his unreliability is way more profound than that. He reports what happens reasonably accurately, but he completely, utterly fails to grasp the ethical reality of his own actions. He twists the meaning of real events just to protect his own self-image. And that leads us to this massive warning from scholar David Atwell. Because we have such intimate front-row access to David's thoughts, his disappointments, and his fantasies, we might actually start to unconsciously side with him. It's wild, but it happens. The text gives us his entire inner life, but we have to remember something absolutely crucial. Access does not equal endorsement. Just because we intimately know David's justifications, it absolutely does not mean the novel is excusing his behavior. Section 2. Power, Consent, and Coercion, the reality of the act. Let's look at the central incident of the novel's first act, the relationship between David and his young student, Melanie. This is exactly where David's ethical blind spots violently crash into the real world. Notice the stark, glaring contrast between these two realities. Internally, David frames his pursuit of Melanie as this elemental passion. He romanticizes his desire as an overwhelming force of nature that just sort of happens to him. But externally, the reality is stark. He is an older professor holding immense institutional authority over her. And the scholars point out clear, undeniable moments in the text where Melanie's willingness is deeply compromised. Basically, David takes a situation of raw, unequal power and transforms into a poetic story about passion just to protect himself. Now, because we're stuck in David's head the whole time, Melanie's true internal feelings are kind of ambiguous to us. But scholar Lucy Graham makes a really critical point here. She argues that just because we don't have access to Melanie's full inner monologue, that doesn't mean we just throw our hands up and say we can't judge the situation. I mean, we know David is her professor. We know he relentlessly pursues her. We know the power dynamic is inherently coercive. The scholarly consensus here is loud and clear. We know more than enough about the structural power imbalance to make very serious ethical judgments about David's exploitation. Section 3. The Myth of the Monster. Why Evil Often Looks Ordinary. So if David's actions are so clearly exploitative, why do we sometimes struggle to condemn him while reading? Well, it's because Coetzee totally dismantles our comforting cultural fantasy that harmful people look and act like obvious cartoonish monsters. David is ordinary. He's cultured. He's human. He is highly educated. He genuinely appreciates romantic poetry, and he loves classical music. He's witty. He's smart. He deeply loves his daughter, Lucy, and, as the novel goes on, he even shows this profound tenderness toward unwanted animals. As scholar Derek Attridge points out, a monster actually teaches us very little because we can just look at a monster and say, well, I am not him. But here is the really unsettling realization. Acknowledging David's humanity must never, ever become a way of reducing the severity of what he does. As the scholars debate, his capacity to appreciate beauty and his later tenderness do not rewrite Melanie's traumatic experience. A person can genuinely love poetry and still ruthlessly abuse unequal power. Intelligence, as it turns out, is not moral vision. Section 4. Hiding behind beautiful language, the privilege of aestheticizing appetite. In fact, that sharp intelligence is exactly what David uses as a shield. Scholar Ella K. Boehmer points out how David leverages his cultural authority, specifically his deep knowledge of Romanticism and the poet Lord Byron, to dress up his predatory behavior in a fancy poetic costume. He frames his desire as a sovereign, unstoppable force. He tells himself he simply submitted to this grand passion. By aestheticizing his appetite, by making it sound beautiful and literary, he completely dodges personal responsibility for the very real harm he causes a subordinate. He grants himself a luxury that Melanie is literally never afforded.
Section 5. The Silence of Melanie. Who gets narrative space?
Which brings us to the most glaring, uncomfortable absence in this entire story, the silenced voice of the victim, Melanie. While David's mind is a wide-open book to us, Melanie remains a locked door. When we map out who actually receives the privilege of complexity in this novel, the imbalance is just staggering. The older male professor, he gets endless narrative space. His desires, his intellectual life, his humiliations, they are deeply and fully examined. Meanwhile, the young woman he exploits is completely sidelined. Her inner life is unexplored, her intellect is marginalized, and her trauma is largely ignored by the narrative lens. The scholars raise a profound point here, especially when you view this text within the context of post-apartheid South Africa. And this is exactly why this matters. For how we judge people and institutions in the real world. Who gets to testify? Who gets to be part of the official story? And who gets endless pages dedicated to their complexity? That is never a politically neutral decision. We shouldn't romanticize Melanie's silence as just some cool literary mystery. We have to recognize that her silence is actively produced by the very unequal power structures that David benefits from.
But wait, this brings up an incredibly provocative question for us to chew on. If Coetzee had given Melanie a long, final monologue explaining exactly how she felt, would that actually have been better? Some scholars argue that demanding a victim completely explain her trauma just for the reader's comfort might be another form of possessing her experience. Leaving her silent and somewhat unknowable might actually be an ethical boundary, preventing us from consuming her pain just so we can figure out exactly how guilty David is. It's a heavy thought, right?
Section 6. The reckoning has just begun. The limits of sovereignty. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the first part of David's mind, we realize something huge. His absolute refusal to grant ownership of meaning to anyone else, his stubborn insistence on defining reality entirely on his own poetic terms, is about to be violently tested. Unpacking David's relationship with Melanie is just the very beginning of an incredible moral unraveling. I mean, what happens when a man who admits the facts refuses to show the remorse the university demands? What happens when his daughter, Lucy, suffers a terrible trauma but completely refuses the narrative of justice he tries to force on her? And why on earth does a novel so focused on human power end with David caring for unwanted dying dogs? There is so much more to this story. We've only just scratched the surface of topic 1. To get the rest, you can visit imaginarytalks.com/disgrace explained by leading Jam Coetzee scholars. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, never mistake access for endorsement. See you next time.